A single sentence can open a door no one ever knew existed. The thought drifted through the warm, amber-lit dining room of Harrington House, a restaurant that looked more like a private museum than a place ordinary people could afford. Velvet walls, brass sconces, oil portraits with eyes that seemed to follow you across the room. And right beneath one of those portraits painted in stern brushstrokes, the figure's face swallowed by shadow, a young waitress leaned forward with a polite, practiced smile. Her braids brushed her shoulders as she carefully set a steaming bowl of chicken soup in front of an elderly man. "Here you go, sir," she said softly. He didn't answer. He simply looked at her. Really looked like he had waited years for this exact moment. Eliza felt a strange tug in her chest. Something about him. The quiet tremor in his hands. The way his coat looked a little too old for such a refined place. The loneliness in his eyes. Then she noticed the corner of a small card peeking out from under his palm. A card so old its edges had begun to fray. Her eyes drifted to the symbol pressed into the paper, an embossed crest, faint but unmistakable. "Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much." Her breath caught. "My mom used to draw something just like that." The entire world seemed to hush. The elderly man froze. His fingers tightened over the card as if guarding it. "That's impossible," he whispered cold. Clipped. A verdict delivered. The air thickened. Behind her, patrons paused mid-conversation, forks hovering. Even the warm lighting felt suddenly colder, as though the portrait above them disapproved. Eliza straightened, cheeks warming. She hadn't meant to say anything. She never spoke out of turn. A server didn't ask questions in a place like this. A server blended into the linen and the polished wood and the quiet wealth. But that symbol, her mother drew it when she was sick, when the nights were long, when memories slipped through her fingers like sand. Eliza would wake to see her mother hunched over a scrap of paper, sketching the same shape again and again like she feared forgetting it. The old man slowly slid the card toward her. The paper whispered against the tablecloth. "For you," he murmured. Eliza hesitated, glancing around. Managers in suits glided between tables. Two older patrons at the back. A couple watched her with mild curiosity, then quickly looked away. The painting above them loomed like a silent witness. She lifted the card. One word sat in the center of the aging paper, written in clean, confident strokes. "Heir." Her pulse stumbled. A word too heavy, too strange, too impossible to belong to her. She raised her eyes, and the man's voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "You were never supposed to disappear." Her stomach twisted. "Sir, I think you've mistaken me for someone else." He shook his head. "No, I spent half my life looking for you." A crack of fear, or was it recognition, ran through her. She felt the portrait above them staring down, its faceless subject suddenly sinister, as if hiding a truth the room had kept buried for decades. Eliza swallowed hard. "What is this? Why give this to me?" The old man's gaze glistened. "Because you deserve to know what was taken." Before she could ask another question, a soft click echoed behind her. The kind of click that didn't belong to silverware or glasses. The kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Two men in dark suits had entered the dining room. Men she had never seen before, yet their posture told its own story. Authority, precision, purpose, and their eyes went straight to the card in her hand. Eliza instinctively curled her fingers around it. The warmth of the soup drifted upward, fogging the air between her and the elderly man as he whispered, "Don't let them take it again." Eliza stood frozen beside the elderly man's table, gripping the weathered card so tightly that the fibers bent beneath her fingers, while the two men in dark suits continued to advance with steady, deliberate steps that felt too rehearsed to be casual. Her heart hammered with a rhythm she barely recognized, and she tried to convince herself that they might simply be customers, yet their synchronized posture and unsmiling precision made the thought collapse instantly. The elderly man lowered his gaze, as if bracing for a storm he had outrun for years, and the tremor in his hands grew unmistakable, threading quiet dread through the golden warmth of the dining room. Eliza placed one foot behind her instinctively, preparing to retreat toward the kitchen, but her body refused to move because the card in her hand seemed to anchor her in place with a weight no larger than a breath, yet heavier than her entire past. When the men reached the border of the dining room, they paused to survey the scene, their eyes lingering a fraction too long on the portrait looming above the table, as if the shadows in the painting whispered an unspoken confirmation. One of them adjusted his tie with a small, sharp motion that felt like a silent warning, and the other produced a phone from his coat, angling it discreetly as if he were capturing evidence rather than checking a message. Eliza forced a polite smile and murmured an excuse about needing to retrieve a fresh napkin, then pivoted swiftly toward the service corridor while tucking the card into her apron before anyone could notice her trembling hands. She slipped through the swinging kitchen door, letting it close behind her with a muted thud that sounded strangely final, and the sudden shift from warm dining room ambience to clattering stainless steel felt like stepping into another world. The head chef glanced up from the stove with a tired frown, asking if another customer had complained, but Eliza brushed him off with a shaky laugh that fooled no one, especially not the sous chef, who noticed her pale expression immediately. She leaned against a shelf of neatly stacked plates, trying to steady her breath, but the embossed symbol on the card blazed inside her mind like a beacon she had seen before, though only in fading pencil sketches her mother obsessively drew during her final months. A flood of fragmented memories rushed back her mother, holding her hand in their tiny apartment, drawing the same crest on junk mail envelopes, sticky notes, and receipts, claiming she was trying to remember something that didn't want to be remembered. Eliza blinked hard and pulled the card out again, running her thumb over the raised crest, feeling its curves and edges, wondering how a stranger in a restaurant could hold a piece of her mother's private obsession with such deliberate intention. The chef barked orders across the kitchen, but his voice felt distant as Eliza slipped toward the employee lockers, grabbing her coat and whispering to the night shift host that she had to step out for a moment, promising she would be back before anyone missed her. When she exited through the side door into the crisp evening air, the city lights shimmered against the dark sky, and for a moment she closed her eyes, letting the cold bite her skin as if it could ground her back in reality. She turned the card over once more, noting the slight discoloration along the edges, the kind that comes from years of being handled, and she wondered whether the elderly man had carried it across states or decades to place it in her hands. A small antique store across the street caught her attention with its dimly lit windows filled with dusty books, silverware, and framed documents that looked older than the building itself, drawing her with a magnetic pull she couldn't quite explain. She crossed the street quickly, pushed open the door that chimed with a delicate ring, and inhaled the scent of aged paper and polished wood as an elderly woman behind the counter peered at her over half-moon glasses. Eliza approached cautiously and asked if the woman recognized the crest on the card, feeling slightly foolish, yet unable to stop, but the woman's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and she demanded to know where Eliza had found it. When Eliza explained that a stranger had given it to her at work, the woman stepped closer and retrieved an enormous ledger from beneath the counter, its leather binding cracked and faded from years of careful use. She flipped through the pages with practiced familiarity until she reached a section marked with an ornate tab, and her finger landed on an entry written in elegant ink that made Eliza's stomach tighten, as if an invisible net were drawing around her. The ledger described a special transfer of custody involving an unnamed infant associated with the Harrington estate, recorded several decades earlier with no follow-up documentation, suggesting the entry had been intentionally obscured or abandoned. Eliza felt her pulse stumble again because the date listed in the ledger aligned eerily with the stories her mother used to tell about adopting her under mysterious and unspoken circumstances. The woman behind the counter explained that the crest belonged to one of the oldest families in the region, known for guarding their legacy with ruthless discretion, especially regarding anything that might threaten the line of inheritance. Eliza stood motionless as the truth tightened its grip around her, and she realized that the card in her hand was not a mistake, not a coincidence, but a calculated act from someone who believed she was connected to a lineage she had never imagined. Before she could ask another question, a soft buzz resonated through the shop's thin windows, followed by the beep of a car door closing, and Eliza felt an unmistakable sense of being followed as shadows shifted across the glass. The antique shop suddenly felt too small, too fragile, too exposed, and the elderly woman urged her to leave by the back entrance, insisting that some families did not appreciate their secrets being disturbed by outsiders, especially those who might unknowingly hold a rightful claim. Eliza slipped out the back door into a narrow alley, clutching the card as though it were both a key and a threat, and she understood with chilling clarity that her life had just split down the middle before the card and after it. Eliza moved cautiously through the narrow alley, feeling the antique shop's back door close behind her with a faint metallic thud that seemed to echo across the brick walls like an unspoken warning she wished she could ignore. The cold night air wrapped around her, sharpening her senses while the dim street lamps cast elongated shadows that swayed with each hesitant step. She took toward the main road where passing cars hummed like distant, indifferent guardians. She kept one hand pressed firmly against the card inside her coat pocket, tracing the embossed crest through the fabric as if the simple outline could tether her thoughts before they drifted too far into fear. When she reached the sidewalk, an elderly woman seated on a nearby bench lifted her head slowly, observing Eliza with an expression that blended curiosity with a subtle flicker of recognition she couldn't quite place. The woman's posture straightened slightly, and she asked whether Eliza was the young server from Harrington House who had rushed out through the side entrance earlier, her voice quivering with a surprising mixture of urgency and relief. Startled, Eliza confirmed she worked there, wondering how a stranger could have noticed her so intently, yet the woman's eyes softened as though she had been waiting for the opportunity to speak to her for much longer than a single evening. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Whitmore, a retired nurse who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, and she explained that she frequently visited the restaurant not for the food, but for the portraits that lined its grand interior. Eliza hesitated but finally asked what the portraits meant to her, and Mrs. Whitmore exhaled slowly before revealing that she had once cared for a young woman who possessed a sketchbook filled with repeated drawings of the same crest Eliza now carried. The word struck Eliza with such force that she nearly lost her balance, because the image of her mother hunched over papers in the dim apartment immediately surfaced, aligning too perfectly with the nurse's somber confession. Mrs. Whitmore described the young woman as quiet and kind, yet often frightened, always checking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to arrive unannounced, though she never fully explained who she feared or why. According to the nurse, the woman had arrived at the hospital late one night with a newborn infant swaddled tightly in a blanket, refusing to disclose the father's identity and insisting that the child must never be connected to the family tied to the crest. Eliza felt her breath falter as she realized the infant described matched her own age at the time, and she understood with chilling clarity that the story was not a vague coincidence, but a direct thread stitched to her life. Mrs. Whitmore continued gently, explaining that the young woman was visited once by two men in long coats who spoke with clipped, rehearsed voices, demanding information about the child while claiming they sought only to ensure the family records remained intact. The nurse recalled how the woman trembled violently during that visit, clutching the infant protectively and refusing to release any details despite the men's increasingly intimidating tone, which lingered in the hospital hall long after they departed. Eliza closed her eyes tightly, trying to imagine her mother facing such pressure alone, and she wondered how many sacrifices had been made in silence to keep her safe from a legacy she had never asked to inherit. Mrs. Whitmore placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, urging her to understand that some families pursued their bloodlines with ruthless persistence, especially those who believed inheritance determined worth far more than truth or compassion. The nurse explained that the woman vanished shortly after being discharged, leaving behind only a paper receipt with the crest carefully sketched in the corner, almost as if she feared forgetting the symbol, yet wished she could bury it forever. Eliza realized her mother had carried that fear for decades, allowing it to shape their life quietly, never revealing the full story because she believed silence was the only shield capable of protecting her daughter from the same shadow. Mrs. Whitmore warned that the sudden interest from strangers meant the past was resurfacing with renewed urgency, and she encouraged Eliza to seek answers before those who guarded the family's secrets decided to write a new version of the truth. The older woman then retrieved a folded piece of stationery from her purse, explaining that she had kept it out of guilt for never tracking down the woman and child years ago, believing the note belonged to the rightful heir mentioned in the hospital whispers. Eliza unfolded the delicate paper carefully, revealing a fragment of a name scribbled hastily in fading ink alongside the same crest embossed on her card, confirming beyond doubt that her mother had been tied to the Harrington lineage. The city lights blurred slightly as tears welled in Eliza's eyes, and she fought to steady her voice while asking the nurse whether her mother had ever spoken about anyone from the Harrington family, especially the grandfather who might have opposed her existence. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated before admitting that the young woman had once whispered about a powerful figure who refused to acknowledge the child, ordering his associates to resolve the complication before the inheritance cycle renewed itself. Eliza felt a chill crawl up her spine at the phrasing, realizing the term complication had likely referred to her, and she understood more clearly why the elderly man at the restaurant had trembled upon seeing her. The nurse urged her to stay vigilant, insisting that the men who once threatened her mother might still serve the same family interests, especially now that someone had dared reveal a piece of the truth by handing her the card marked Heir. Eliza thanked the woman with a voice strained by dread and gratitude, knowing she could not linger any longer in the open street, and she tucked both the card and the paper fragment carefully inside her coat. As she stepped away from the bench, the chill of the night deepened, yet her steps hardened with purpose, because she realized that the first real witness to her mother's hidden past had just confirmed the one thing she never expected to hear. Her existence had never been an accident, but a threat powerful enough to shake an entire family tree that believed they could bury the truth forever. Eliza walked briskly toward the main avenue, feeling the cold air sting her cheeks, while the weight of the card and paper fragment pressed heavily inside her coat, as though urging her to confront truths she had avoided her entire life. The streetlights flickered against the pavement with a wary glow, and each passing car seemed to cast shifting shadows that reminded her of the men who had followed her earlier, intensifying the growing sense that her movements were no longer entirely her own. She kept her gaze forward and focused on the distant corner where Harrington House's tall windows shimmered, wondering whether she should return to work or disappear before anyone realized she had slipped out unexpectedly during her shift. When she reached the intersection, she noticed a sleek, black sedan idling near the curb with tinted windows and polished chrome that reflected the city's neon lights like a silent predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Her stomach tightened as the sedan's engine hummed with a steady purr that felt too deliberate, and the vehicle's presence lingered with an unsettling patience that made her pulse stumble uncontrollably. A man in a charcoal coat stepped out from the passenger side and adjusted his cufflinks with calculated precision, scanning the sidewalk with a measured gaze that swept past her once before, returning sharply as though he recognized something he had been instructed to find. Eliza forced herself to maintain a calm stride, but her heart hammered violently as the man approached her with a polite yet unmistakably authoritative posture, speaking her name with a tone that blended courtesy and quiet command. He introduced himself as Mr. Alden, an attorney representing the Harrington family, and he claimed he merely wished to discuss a misunderstanding involving property that did not belong outside the estate's internal records. The phrase "internal records" sent a jolt of fear down her spine, and she instinctively clasped her coat tighter, aware that the card inside had become a tangible target rather than a mysterious artifact whose meaning she barely understood. Mr. Alden maintained a controlled smile while explaining that the Harrington family valued order and privacy, especially when it concerned documentation that could be misinterpreted by individuals unfamiliar with the complexities of inheritance law. Eliza attempted to step around him, insisting she knew nothing about their records, but he subtly shifted to block her path with a gesture so smooth it felt rehearsed, as though he had practiced this exact conversation many times before confronting her. Without raising his voice, he mentioned that the elderly man who had given her the card suffered from moments of confusion and should not be taken seriously, implying that anything he handed out held no legal or personal significance. The dismissive explanation ignited a spark of anger in her chest, because the trembling sincerity in the elderly man's eyes had not resembled confusion, but rather the desperation of someone fighting against years of buried truth. Mr. Alden leaned closer and advised her to surrender the card so the estate could ensure no inaccuracies disrupted the family's carefully maintained public image, emphasizing that cooperation would prevent unnecessary complications for everyone involved. Eliza stepped back sharply, refusing to comply, and she noticed the slight twitch in his jaw that betrayed his controlled demeanor, confirming her suspicion that he was not accustomed to resistance from people he perceived as insignificant. He offered her a final warning delivered with polite sharpness, stating that the Harrington family had considerable influence in the city and that ignoring their requests could lead to consequences far more troublesome than she might expect. With her breath trembling, she replied that she needed time to understand what the elderly man had given her, and although Mr. Alden nodded politely, the cold calculation in his eyes revealed he had no intention of allowing her that time. He signaled to the driver, and the sedan pulled slowly away from the curb with a lingering hum that felt like a promise rather than a departure, leaving Eliza standing alone beneath the streetlights with dread coiled tightly in her chest. She walked away in quick strides, sensing more strongly than ever that the family's reach extended far beyond casual observation, and that each step she took brought her deeper into a conflict she had unknowingly inherited. Her mind raced with fragments of the nurse's story, the ledger entry, and her mother's frantic drawings, all converging to form a pattern more sinister than coincidence, suggesting her birth had once threatened a carefully scripted lineage. As she continued down the block, she noticed another figure standing near a bookstore awning, a middle-aged woman with gentle eyes who stepped forward hesitantly and asked whether she was Eliza, her voice trembling with cautious hope rather than suspicion. Eliza paused, bracing herself for another confrontation, but the woman introduced herself as Margaret, a former housekeeper for the Harrington estate, who claimed she had followed Eliza from the restaurant after recognizing the card given by the elderly man. Margaret's voice softened as she explained that the family had concealed numerous secrets over the years, including the existence of a child whose disappearance had triggered tension behind the estate's closed doors, despite every effort to silence the truth. She admitted that she had overheard heated arguments within the mansion long ago, arguments about a newborn who was never supposed to survive, and a woman who had been forced to flee before the family's enforcers could retrieve what they considered their rightful heir. Eliza felt her breath tighten as Margaret urged her to be cautious, explaining that the Harrington family operated behind an elegant facade but wielded influence so quietly and forcefully that most people never recognized danger until it was far too late. The housekeeper reached into her purse and handed Eliza a small folded note written years earlier by the elderly man, who had once confided in her that he suspected his granddaughter might still be alive despite the lies circulated throughout the estate. Eliza unfolded the note and read a brief plea scrawled in trembling handwriting, stating that if the child ever resurfaced, she must seek the truth before the family erased every trace of her existence a second time. Margaret warned her that Mr. Alden's presence meant the estate had officially identified her as a threat, and she should expect increased surveillance until the family determined whether she would comply or resist their attempts to reclaim the card. Eliza stood beneath the dim glow of the bookstore sign, gripping the note in one hand and the card in the other. Realizing that the stakes had expanded far beyond personal curiosity and now involved a centuries-old structure of power determined to protect itself. With her pulse thundering, she understood that every step from this point forward carried consequences she could no longer ignore, because the truth she sought had awakened a force that would stop at nothing to ensure its own survival. Eliza hurried away from the dimly lit bookstore corner, feeling Margaret's warning coil through her thoughts like a tightening rope that urged her to move quickly while her surroundings grew increasingly unfamiliar and threatening. The night pressed heavily around her, and each passing car seemed to slow for a heartbeat longer than normal, as though unseen eyes evaluated her every movement with quiet precision that unsettled her more deeply than she wanted to admit. She clutched the folded note and the embossed card tightly inside her coat, sensing that these fragile objects had somehow become targets painted directly across her chest, marking her as someone the Harrington family no longer intended to ignore. The elderly man's trembling plea echoed relentlessly in her mind, reminding her that he had risked confronting the family's sprawling influence to place the truth into her hands before they could bury it under layers of polished deception. She took a sharp turn into a quieter street where the distant hum of traffic softened into an eerie silence, creating a hollow space that intensified the unsettling feeling that someone might be following her with careful, measured steps. A flicker of movement near a row of parked cars caught her attention, prompting her to quicken her pace while trying to remain composed, though her heartbeat thudded loudly enough that she feared it would betray her presence. When she passed the narrow entrance of a small laundromat, she caught a brief reflection in the window of a tall figure stepping from behind a lamppost, confirming her growing suspicion that she was no longer walking alone in the night. She ducked into the laundromat with a swift, practiced motion and positioned herself behind a running dryer, pretending to check her phone while glancing discreetly at the glass door to see whether the shadow would follow her inside. The figure paused at the doorway, scanning the interior with a calm deliberation that revealed unmistakable intent, yet he eventually turned away with a calculated pivot, as if deciding that her momentary detour did not warrant unnecessary attention. Eliza waited several tense moments before slipping back onto the sidewalk, her breath uneven, as she realized that the quiet safeguard of anonymity had evaporated the moment the card touched her hand inside Harrington House earlier that evening. She moved quickly toward a nearby bus stop, blending with the late-night commuters who kept to themselves, but her sense of safety remained fragile because she knew the Harringtons possessed resources far more sophisticated than a single shadow. When the bus finally arrived, she boarded with trembling fingers and chose a seat near the back, where she could watch both the aisle and the passing streets, hoping that elevation and movement would provide her a temporary reprieve from pursuit. As the city slipped by outside the fogged windows, she unfolded Margaret's note again, studying the shaky handwriting that described a storm of arguments within the estate years ago about a child who threatened the family's carefully structured legacy. The words hinted at a conspiracy shaped by fear of disruption rather than love or duty, revealing a ruthless determination to protect the family name, even at the expense of a newborn whose existence merely complicated the inheritance order. Eliza considered the possibilities with growing dread, realizing she was piecing together fragments of a truth deliberately fractured by those who benefited most from its disappearance, and each detail sharpened the outline of a threat she could no longer ignore. When the bus reached her neighborhood, she stepped off cautiously and scanned the street for any signs of surveillance. Noticing a dark sedan parked at the far end, with headlights dimmed yet unmistakably pointed in her direction, she forced herself not to panic, instead walking steadily toward her apartment building while pretending not to notice the vehicle, though the weight of its silent observation pressed heavily between her shoulder blades. Inside her apartment, she locked the door twice and leaned against it with trembling exhaustion, listening for any unfamiliar sounds before crossing the living room to switch on the small lamp that illuminated her cluttered coffee table. She spread the card, the nurse's note, and the ledger photo she had snapped earlier across the table, arranging them side by side in hopes of discovering a pattern that might reveal what the Harringtons had fought so desperately to conceal. The crest appeared on all three items with almost identical detail, suggesting a lineage so meticulously preserved that even slight variations were unlikely, and the realization struck her with chilling clarity that these symbols formed a quiet map of her origins. As she studied the handwriting on the fragment Margaret had given her, she noticed a reference to an internal meeting within the estate that had taken place shortly after her mother had fled, including a statement about final measures required to secure the line. Eliza whispered the phrase slowly, feeling its sinister implications sink into her chest, because it implied actions far more aggressive than simple coercion, hinting that the Harringtons would eliminate anything or anyone that threatened their lineage. A sudden knock at the door jolted her entire body, sending a shockwave of fear through her bones as she froze in place, listening to the faint metallic echo vibrate along the floorboards beneath her bare feet. The knock came again, softer this time yet unmistakably deliberate, and her breath tightened as she debated whether to remain silent or call out, knowing either choice carried unpredictable consequences. She approached the peephole cautiously and saw a familiar face Margaret standing with an anxious expression, glancing repeatedly over her shoulder as though expecting unwelcome company at any moment. Eliza opened the door quickly and ushered her inside, noticing how the woman clutched her purse with white-knuckled tension, confirming that whatever news she carried was both urgent and dangerous. Margaret explained that she had overheard Mr. Alden speaking on the phone shortly after leaving the restaurant, and he had issued instructions to accelerate a transition plan involving property documentation connected to a missing heir. She revealed that the estate intended to reclaim the card by any means necessary before sunrise, fearing that its existence might disrupt an upcoming legal proceeding intended to cement control of the family fortune. Eliza felt a cold surge of fear wash through her, realizing that the stakes extended far beyond personal history and now involved a struggle over wealth and dominance that placed her squarely in the crosshairs of a powerful dynasty. Margaret urged her to leave the apartment immediately and find temporary refuge somewhere the estate could not easily reach, emphasizing that hesitation would grant the Harringtons the advantage they already believed they possessed. Eliza gathered the documents and stuffed them into her bag with trembling urgency, understanding for the first time that her fight for truth had transformed into a battle for survival, one she had never expected to inherit, yet could no longer walk away from. Eliza followed Margaret down the dim hallway with hurried steps, feeling every light flicker pulse through her nerves, as though the entire building sensed the urgency pressing against her spine with relentless weight. They descended the narrow stairwell instead of using the elevator because Margaret insisted that the Harringtons monitored public access points, especially in older apartment complexes where outdated systems made unauthorized entry almost effortless for determined individuals. When they reached the back exit, Eliza hesitated for a moment, gripping the strap of her bag tightly while she considered the frightening possibility that leaving through this door might place her directly in the path of whoever had been following her earlier. Margaret pushed the door open gently and revealed a quiet alley bathed in muted amber light, assuring her that they would take separate routes to reduce suspicion and meet again in a safe location she trusted completely. Eliza stepped out into the cold air, allowing the door to close behind her with a soft click that echoed like a farewell to the version of herself who had lived peacefully within those walls until only a few hours earlier. She moved down the alley quickly, keeping close to the brick walls as she emerged onto a broader street where the distant wail of a siren blended with the rhythmic hum of traffic weaving through the city's midnight pulse. Her thoughts raced chaotically, but she forced herself to focus on a single objective. She needed to gather verifiable evidence that connected her mother's disappearance to the Harrington estate before the family succeeded in recapturing control of the narrative. The first stop she considered was the county archive building several blocks away, a place she had visited once for a school project, remembering how public files collected dust in tall metal drawers that hardly anyone bothered to open anymore. She walked briskly toward the archive, blending with the sparse crowd of late-night workers whose weary faces suggested they would never notice someone quietly chasing answers through the shadows of a sprawling city. When she reached the building, she slipped inside through the older revolving door, grateful that the night guard barely looked up from his security monitor, allowing her to move unnoticed toward the public records room at the far end of the hall. The room smelled faintly of cardboard and disinfectant, illuminated by fluorescent lights that buzzed softly above rows of filing cabinets, holding decades of forgotten county paperwork that rarely saw the light of day. Eliza searched for the birth records section, scanning labels with trembling fingers until she found the drawer containing documents from the year she was born, pulling it open slowly as though afraid the metal might screech loudly enough to attract unwanted attention. Inside, she leafed through brittle certificates and handwritten forms, noticing how several entries appeared to be copied or corrected, suggesting irregularities she felt compelled to examine before dismissing as clerical errors. She eventually reached her own section alphabetically, only to discover a glaring absence that struck her with enough force to make her knees weaken. The official birth certificate for her legal name was missing entirely from the drawer. A single replacement form had been inserted in its place, listing a hospital she had never visited and an attending physician she did not recognize, confirming that someone had manipulated her records long before she learned to read her own name. Her breath tightened as realization washed over her. The Harrington estate had not merely hidden her existence, but strategically rewritten it to ensure she could never trace her origins through official channels, effectively erasing her from any verifiable genealogical trail. She snapped a photo of the altered form before returning the drawer to its silent position, sensing that she had uncovered only the first fracture in a much larger structure of deception meticulously constructed by the estate's inner circle. Leaving the building quietly, she stepped back into the cold night and debated her next move, knowing she needed evidence beyond paperwork to expose a conspiracy of this magnitude without being dismissed as a misguided intruder. Margaret had mentioned overhearing conversations among the estate staff years ago, suggesting that someone inside the household still carried guilt about their role in the cover-up, and Eliza decided she needed to find that person before the family silenced them permanently. She headed toward the residential neighborhood bordering the historic Harrington grounds, walking past towering wrought iron gates that shielded manicured lawns and darkened windows belonging to some of the wealthiest homes in the region. Her heart raced as she approached a narrow side street where several estate employees lived, recalling Margaret's hint about a gardener named Harold who had once served the family during the turbulent period surrounding her mother's disappearance. She located his small cottage at the end of the lane, noticing a flicker of light inside despite the late hour, and she knocked gently on the door while hoping he would not react with suspicion or fear. A weary man with weathered hands and tired eyes opened the door cautiously, studying her face with brief confusion before stepping back with sudden understanding, as though he had recognized the faint resemblance she carried from a past he had tried to forget. He invited her inside with a resigned sigh, explaining that he had expected this confrontation eventually, because secrets buried by powerful people never remain hidden forever, especially when marked by guilt so heavy it followed him into every sleepless night. Eliza listened intently as Harold recounted how he had seen her mother flee the estate grounds decades earlier, with a newborn in her arms, pursued by men whose loyalty to the Harrington patriarch overshadowed any moral hesitation. He described hearing hushed arguments about inheritance rights, illegitimate bloodlines, and the possibility that the child might disrupt the carefully planned transfer of power within the family, prompting drastic measures to prevent unwanted scandal. Tears stung Eliza's eyes as Harold admitted his deepest regret he had tried to help her mother escape by opening a maintenance gate at the edge of the property, but he had never learned whether she reached safety or suffered retaliation from the family. He handed Eliza a folded envelope he had kept hidden for years, urging her to open it only when she felt ready, explaining that it contained a confession he had been too afraid to deliver to authorities because the estate's influence extended far beyond county borders. She accepted the envelope with trembling hands, understanding that this piece of evidence could become the cornerstone of her investigation, yet also recognizing that possessing it placed her in even greater danger than before. As she left Harold's cottage and stepped back into the night, she felt the weight of two converging realities, pressing heavily against her chest. The truth was drawing closer with every step she took, but so were the forces determined to keep it buried forever. Eliza walked away from Harold's cottage with the envelope pressed tightly against her chest, feeling the night shift into an unnerving stillness that signaled the approaching storm she had been warned about since the moment the card entered her life. The air carried a faint, metallic chill, and the quiet surrounding the narrow lane felt strangely deliberate, as though the world itself were holding its breath, while she navigated the fragile boundary between truth and danger with increasingly uncertain steps. She turned onto the main road, hoping to disappear among the occasional cars passing through the sleeping neighborhood, yet she couldn't ignore the sensation of unseen eyes tracking her every movement with patient determination. When a pair of headlights appeared behind her, she quickened her pace, telling herself it was only an ordinary driver, though the vehicle's slow crawl along the curb betrayed an intent that went far beyond simple coincidence. The car crept forward with a measured grace that made her skin prickle, and she slipped into a side street beside an old church, hoping the shadows would conceal her long enough for the sedan to lose interest and continue down the road. Instead, the engine's steady hum followed her like a whispered threat, forcing her to dart behind the church's stone wall where she crouched low, listening carefully as the vehicle rolled to a stop only a few yards from where she hid. 2 car doors opened quietly, and the deep murmur of muted voices drifted through the cold air, leaving her no doubt that the Harrington estate had decided to escalate their pursuit with a level of resolve she had feared, but not fully anticipated. She held her breath and waited while the footsteps moved slowly across the pavement, pausing at intervals as though the men were scanning the shadows for any sign of movement from their elusive target. When one of them announced that Mr. Alden wanted the girl found before dawn, her heart lurched violently, confirming that the family had shifted from passive observation to active retrieval with an intensity that suggested growing desperation. The men eventually returned to the sedan, their frustration evident in the heavy slam of its doors, and she exhaled shakily as the vehicle pulled away with reluctant acceleration, leaving her momentarily safe but increasingly aware of the shrinking time she possessed. Eliza emerged from behind the wall and checked the street cautiously before continuing toward the downtown district, where the glow of neon signs offered a faint illusion of safety that she desperately needed, despite knowing it was only temporary. She entered a small 24-hour cafe tucked between a pawn shop and a pharmacy, choosing a booth near the back where she could watch the door, while gathering her scattered thoughts beneath the soft hum of old ceiling lights. The envelope Harold had given her felt heavier now, carrying decades of remorse and concealed truth, and she unfolded it carefully, revealing several pages of handwritten testimony describing the night her mother escaped the estate grounds in chaos and fear. Harold's confession detailed how the Harrington patriarch had ordered his subordinates to retrieve the newborn at any cost, believing the child's existence posed a severe threat to the estate's succession plan and financial control. The letter described how her mother had begged Harold for help, insisting that the child must never return to the estate because the patriarch had already made plans that would ensure the heir problem was solved permanently. Eliza trembled as she read each line, realizing her survival had depended on a single act of compassion from a man who had carried the guilt of silent defiance for decades, while the Harringtons maintained their facade of immaculate lineage. She photographed each page as evidence, then tucked everything carefully inside her bag, knowing she needed to protect both the proof and herself with far more caution than she had shown earlier in the night. As she prepared to leave the cafe, she noticed 2 men entering through the front door, their sharp attire and synchronized movements unmistakably similar to the individuals who had pursued her near the church only moments earlier. She lowered her head and slid quietly out of the booth, moving swiftly toward the restroom as the men scanned the dining area with the tense awareness of hunters searching for a recently sighted target. Inside the restroom, she locked the door and steadied her breathing, examining the small frosted window beside the sink that offered a narrow escape route into the alley behind the cafe. With trembling hands, she pushed the window open and climbed through, landing on the cold pavement just as she heard the muffled voices of the men questioning the barista inside, asking whether a young woman with dark hair had passed through recently. Eliza hurried down the alley, slipping between overflowing trash bins and abandoned crates, following the faint glow of distant streetlights that promised a temporary path away from the tightening grip of the estate's relentless pursuit. She turned the corner and nearly collided with a tall figure standing beneath a flickering street lamp, but relief washed over her when she recognized Margaret, whose anxious expression suggested she had been searching frantically for Eliza since they separated. Margaret warned her that the estate had activated a broader search effort involving private operatives and off-duty security contractors who were instructed to retrieve the card discreetly before the family's morning meeting convened. At the mansion, she explained that the patriarch's health had declined rapidly in recent weeks, and the family feared he might reveal secrets on his deathbed, making Eliza's sudden appearance a destabilizing threat they needed to neutralize immediately. Eliza listened with rising dread, realizing she had become the keystone in a silent war between truth and legacy, and the Harringtons intended to crush the truth before it exposed the cracks beneath their pristine public image. Margaret insisted they continue moving before the operatives closed in on the neighborhood, guiding Eliza toward an underground parking structure where she had parked an old sedan that blended easily into the city's nightscape. They climbed inside, and Margaret drove with careful efficiency, navigating side streets and unmonitored back roads while explaining that their next destination held the final piece of the story, someone who knew more than Harold and had waited years to speak. As the car disappeared into the deeper outskirts of the city, Eliza clutched the envelope tightly and realized that the Harringtons were no longer simply defending their reputation. They were preparing to erase her completely if she failed to uncover the truth in time. Margaret steered the old sedan through a stretch of quiet industrial streets where aging warehouses stood like slumbering giants, their rusted metal walls reflecting faint slivers of moonlight that shimmered across the cracked pavement beneath the speeding tires. Eliza watched the scenery pass in a blur, feeling a mixture of fear and anticipation churn inside her chest as she wondered who could possibly hold more knowledge than Harold, and why such a person had remained hidden for so many years. Margaret tightened her grip on the steering wheel, while explaining that the Harrington family had relied on an inner circle of trusted staff whose silence was guaranteed through loyalty, fear, or carefully manipulated promises that rarely favored those outside the bloodline. She added that one member of that inner circle had recently retired under questionable circumstances, disappearing quietly from the estate after decades of service, without leaving a forwarding address or explanation for his abrupt departure. When Eliza asked whether the man had been involved in the cover-up surrounding her birth, Margaret nodded solemnly, revealing that he had overseen security operations during the exact period when her mother had fled in fear for her life. The sedan turned onto a winding road lined with tall pines, and the gentle sway of their shadows across the windshield created an eerie rhythm that seemed to whisper faint warnings about the secrets waiting at the end of the drive. They eventually stopped in front of a small cabin nestled against the edge of the forest, where soft orange light spilled through partially drawn curtains, suggesting the occupant had been awake for hours, perhaps expecting visitors or fearing unwelcome ones. Margaret instructed Eliza to remain calm and speak carefully, explaining that the man's trust had eroded dramatically after witnessing how the Harrington patriarch punished anyone who dared to question family directives. Eliza stepped onto the wooden porch with cautious steps, feeling each board creak under her weight as she approached the weathered door and knocked gently, uncertain whether she should pray for the man's cooperation or pray he wasn't home at all. After several tense seconds, the door opened a few inches, revealing an elderly man with stern features, softened by exhaustion, his sharp gaze flicking between Eliza and Margaret with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant recognition. He opened the door wider and motioned silently for them to enter, leading them into a modest living room filled with stacks of old security logs, maps, and labeled folders that suggested years of unresolved conscience weighing heavily upon the man's shoulders. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a brittle edge, telling Eliza that he had known this day would come, though he had hoped the family's internal turmoil would settle before anyone came searching for ghosts long buried beneath polished traditions. He introduced himself as Samuel, once the chief of estate security, and admitted that he had watched the Harrington dynasty fracture from within as ruthless ambition replaced loyalty, transforming the family into a machine fueled by fear rather than legacy. Eliza sat opposite him and placed her bag on the floor, explaining that she sought only the truth about her mother and her own origins, unaware until recently that both had been tied so deeply to a family determined to erase inconvenient bloodlines. Samuel listened carefully before pulling a thick folder from a nearby stack, laying it on the table with trembling hands while explaining that its contents contained decades of notes he had gathered quietly, in case someone sought justice rather than control. He opened the folder to reveal detailed surveillance records, confidential memos, and internal correspondence exchanged among the estate's senior advisors, all referencing the lineage complication that had threatened to disrupt the patriarch's succession plan. Eliza scanned the documents while trying to steady her breathing, noticing how often her mother's initials appeared in the margins, always accompanied by warnings about the unpredictable consequences of allowing her daughter to survive. Samuel leaned forward and confessed that he had once questioned the family's extreme measures, only to be silenced by the patriarch's chilling assurance that he would restore purity to the line by eliminating all potential claimants outside the approved inheritance ladder. He described how this obsession had fractured the family internally, with several members expressing doubts in secret, while others clung to the patriarch's commands in hopes of securing their own positions within the estate's future power structure. Eliza sensed the strain in Samuel's voice as he recounted how guilt had consumed him slowly over the years, driving him to collect evidence that might one day protect the child whose existence had been deemed too dangerous to acknowledge openly. He slid a final envelope across the table, explaining that it contained a recorded statement from one of the patriarch's sons, who had privately expressed remorse for obeying directives that had caused immeasurable suffering for both her mother and countless others, silenced by the family. The confession had never been shared publicly, Samuel explained, because the patriarch's allies controlled every legal channel, ensuring all inconvenient testimony was buried beneath forged documents or conveniently timed resignations. Eliza opened the envelope with trembling fingers and read the handwritten note inside, realizing that a key member of the Harrington family had chosen conscience over tradition, attempting to reveal the truth before being quietly removed from the estate. The note revealed that internal turmoil had intensified in recent years, with various branches of the family turning against one another as the patriarch's health declined and fear spread that he might reveal long-suppressed truths on his deathbed. Samuel warned Eliza that this internal fracture was the only reason she remained alive, because several family members were conflicted about whether the truth should finally be exposed or buried beneath one last vicious act of silence. He urged her to act quickly, explaining that the morning meeting at the estate would determine whether the next generation embraced transparency or doubled down on ruthless control, making her discovery of the truth both urgent and profoundly dangerous. As he continued speaking, the cabin lights flickered softly, and all three froze when the sound of gravel crunching outside reached their ears, signaling the arrival of a vehicle that did not belong to any of them and had approached without headlights. Samuel moved quietly to the window and peeked through the curtain, his expression tightening as he whispered that the family had tracked Eliza's movements much faster than expected, forcing them to make a decision before the night closed in completely. Eliza felt her heartbeat accelerate as the weight of Samuel's revelations intertwined with the immediate threat outside, and she grasped the folder tightly, realizing that this collection of painful truths might be the only weapon she possessed against the dynasty determined to end her story. Samuel remained perfectly still beside the window, his breath held tight as the unfamiliar vehicle settled into silence, casting long shadows across the cabin walls that trembled faintly beneath the soft flicker of the aging lamp. Eliza clutched the folder against her chest, feeling its edges dig into her palms while the weight of its contents pressed heavily against every fragile belief she once held about her life before the Harrington name surfaced from the dark. Margaret stood near the doorway with tense shoulders, whispering that the estate rarely sent more than 2 operatives unless the matter was considered urgent, suggesting that the impending confrontation carried implications far larger than a simple retrieval mission. Eliza tried to steady her thoughts, but the room felt increasingly smaller as the crackling tension thickened like smoke, pushing her toward a realization she had attempted to avoid since the night first began unraveling into danger. Samuel motioned for both women to join him at the table, insisting that the next few minutes might determine whether the truth reached daylight or vanished beneath another layer of the family's meticulously constructed lies. He urged Eliza to open the folder fully and examine the final document, explaining that its contents revealed the true nature of her connection to the elderly man who had handed her the card inside Harrington House. Her trembling fingers slid the last page from its sleeve, and she stared at the faded signature beneath a short statement, identifying the patriarch as her biological grandfather, confirming that she was not merely an inconvenience but a direct blood heir. The revelation washed over her like a powerful undertow, dragging her into a turbulent mixture of shock, confusion, and inexplicable grief as she realized the man who had tried to erase her existence was the same man whose legacy she now threatened. Margaret spoke gently, explaining that the elderly man at the restaurant was her grandfather's estranged brother, a man who disagreed vehemently with the family's choice to eliminate any potential claim that might challenge the patriarch's children. This meant the man who had given her the card had acted at great personal risk, choosing loyalty to truth rather than loyalty to power, despite understanding that helping her would ignite the very conflict he had tried for years to prevent. Eliza felt a deep ache form beneath her ribs as she pictured his trembling expression, realizing how much courage it must have taken for him to hand her the card in public, knowing the estate was watching him as closely as they now watched her. Samuel's voice grew heavier as he explained that the patriarch had fractured the family through decades of ruthless control, pushing several relatives into silent rebellion, while others clung desperately to his promises of wealth and influence. He continued, revealing that her mother had been the patriarch's son's partner, a relationship considered unacceptable by the family because she lacked the lineage and connections deemed necessary to preserve the estate's reputation. The patriarch had ordered his son to end the relationship, and when the order was defied, he responded with a level of malice that unraveled the family's stability, ultimately driving her mother into hiding with the newborn child he had deemed a threat. Eliza pressed her hand against her mouth as waves of disbelief surged through her, realizing that she had inherited not only a hidden birthright, but also the remnants of a fractured dynasty torn apart by fear, ego, and unrelenting obsession with control. Margaret leaned closer and urged her to accept that she was no longer a powerless bystander but a central figure in the family's buried truth, possessing evidence capable of toppling the narrative the patriarch had spent decades crafting. Eliza struggled to respond, but the words caught in her throat as the weight of the moment pressed down with suffocating intensity, forcing her to confront the legacy she had unknowingly carried since childhood. Samuel placed a steady hand on her shoulder, explaining that she had 2 choices: run and allow the estate to continue its tactics unchecked, or stand and expose the truth. Risking the wrath of those who believed silence was the only acceptable outcome. He told her that the patriarch's health had deteriorated rapidly, making the coming hours critical because the estate planned to finalize inheritance documentation at dawn, solidifying control before the next generation could challenge their authority. The tension inside the cabin grew heavier as the sound of footsteps approached the porch, slow and deliberate, each step echoing like a countdown to a confrontation Eliza could no longer avoid. She felt her pulse hammer violently as the doorknob twitched subtly, followed by a firm knock that reverberated through the quiet room and sent a cold shiver across her spine. Margaret whispered that they were out of time, urging Eliza to speak her truth now rather than wait for the estate to twist it into something unrecognizable, emphasizing that silence had already cost her family more than enough. Eliza exhaled shakily and opened the folder again, reviewing the documents that confirmed her heritage and the brutality behind her mother's disappearance, feeling something within her shift from fear to a quiet, determined fire. She lifted her gaze to Samuel and Margaret, realizing she owed her mother and herself the courage to face the truth, even if doing so meant stepping into a battlefield shaped by decades of betrayal and manipulation. A second knock struck the door with sharper force, breaking the fragile stillness as the shadows outside grew deeper, concealing faces she could only assume belonged to those sent to retrieve her before the morning meeting commenced. Eliza rose slowly from the table, holding the folder tightly against her chest, and whispered that she was ready to confront the truth, even if the consequences would reshape everything she had ever known about herself or her family. Samuel nodded with grim approval, moving toward the back exit, while urging both women to follow quickly before the estate operatives forced their way inside, understanding that the next steps would determine whether the truth finally escaped the dynasty's iron grasp. As Eliza stepped toward the rear door, the cabin lights flickered once more, casting her shadow across the floor like a faint echo of her mother's silhouette years before, carrying the same fragile hope that the truth might survive long enough to matter. Samuel ushered Eliza and Margaret through the narrow back hallway, urging them to remain silent while the heavy knocks against the front door grew steadily more forceful, echoing through the small cabin like an ominous drumbeat announcing the final approach of danger. Eliza tightened her hold on the folder as they stepped into the frigid night air behind the cabin, feeling the wind whip against her face while her heartbeat pounded with a mixture of fear and renewed determination that pushed her forward with unexpected clarity. The moon cast a pale glow across the gravel path leading toward the forest, illuminating the silhouettes of tall pines that swayed gently in the cold breeze like silent sentinels guarding the truth she carried close to her chest. Samuel instructed them to stay low and move quickly toward a hidden footpath he had used frequently during late-night patrols, explaining that the estate operatives would likely attempt to sweep the perimeter within minutes. Eliza followed his steady stride, trying to calm her breath, while the memory of the documents inside the folder replayed relentlessly in her mind, reminding her that the truth now rested entirely in her hands, waiting to be wielded with both courage and precision. They slipped deeper into the forest where the shadows thickened around them, muffling the distant sounds of footsteps and muted voices emanating from the cabin as the operatives realized their targets had vanished into the night. Margaret kept glancing behind them nervously, whispering that the estate's men were trained to track movement quickly, yet Eliza sensed something shifting inside her, a quiet resolve replacing the panic that had once clouded her judgment. She understood she could no longer rely solely on fleeing. The time had come to strike back with deliberate intelligence, using the evidence she possessed to destabilize the very system that sought to erase her before dawn. Samuel led them to a clearing where an abandoned ranger station stood partially hidden beneath tangled vines, and he explained that the station still possessed a working radio line that connected to the county's emergency dispatch center. Eliza realized instantly what this meant. She could force the Harringtons into exposure by sending the documents directly to multiple recipients, ensuring the truth would spread beyond the family's reach before their operatives could silence her again. With trembling focus, she entered the station and approached the dusty metal desk, placing the folder before her, while Margaret secured the door, and Samuel scanned the surrounding forest for signs of pursuit. She laid out the documents carefully, aligning each page in order while thinking through her next steps, aware that the calm she felt now was not weakness, but a deliberate stillness, born from necessity and sharpened by survival. Using her phone's hotspot, she connected the ranger station's outdated computer to the internet and began scanning each document, watching them appear on the screen with stark clarity that contrasted painfully with the chaos unfolding outside. She composed a single message addressed to a network of recipients, regional journalists, independent investigators, county officials, and legal advocates, knowing that distributing the truth widely reduced the estate's power to suppress it quietly. Before sending the packet, she paused for a moment to steady her breath, realizing that this act represented the first intentional strike against a dynasty that had spent decades manipulating every narrative connected to its name. Margaret touched her shoulder gently, urging her to trust her instincts, while Samuel nodded with approving firmness, understanding that retaliation delivered with calm precision often possessed more power than any physical confrontation. Eliza clicked, "Send," releasing the documents into the digital expanse, and a palpable silence filled the room as the message left the outbox, carrying the truth into places the Harringtons could no longer control or corrupt. Almost immediately, Samuel's walkie crackled softly, picking up distant chatter that suggested the estate's operatives had discovered their absence and were now spreading through the forest in coordinated search lines. Eliza closed the laptop and tucked the remaining papers back into her folder, fully aware that the next phase of the confrontation required her to remain composed, even as the weight of her actions drew danger closer with every passing second. She stepped outside the station and observed the tree line with quiet defiance, feeling the cold night wind rush against her face while the darkness shifted with subtle hints of movement from the approaching search teams. Instead of retreating further, she walked toward the edge of the clearing, facing the forest head-on, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, knowing her message had already set irreversible consequences in motion. Margaret whispered urgently for her to return to the station, but Samuel placed a hand on the woman's arm, recognizing the expression on Eliza's face as the unmistakable calm that precedes a decisive turning point in a long-fought battle. Voices emerged from the shadows as several operatives stepped into the clearing, their dark uniforms blending with the night while their expressions remained unreadable behind controlled, professional masks shaped by years of obedience. One of them demanded she hand over the documents immediately, insisting she was interfering with protected estate affairs, but Eliza responded with a steady voice, explaining that the files were already in the hands of multiple authorities who would expose any wrongdoing. Her words caused a visible ripple of unease among the operatives, who exchanged uncertain glances as they realized the situation had evolved far beyond a simple retrieval mission orchestrated within the family's usual parameters. Eliza continued speaking with measured calm, telling them that the patriarch's crimes had been recorded, witnessed, and now distributed, leaving the estate only one choice: acknowledge the truth or face unprecedented scrutiny from the world beyond their gates. Samuel stepped forward protectively, reminding the operatives that any attempt to harm Eliza would now be publicly traceable, especially with her whereabouts documented by the emergency dispatch system activated through the ranger station. A tense silence followed, stretching across the clearing like a taut wire ready to snap, until the lead operative finally lowered his stance, recognizing that their orders no longer aligned with the rapidly shifting balance of power Eliza had triggered. Eliza held her ground with unwavering composure, her voice steady, interviews from former estate staff and relatives, suggesting that the Harrington reputation would soon shift dramatically depending on how they responded in the coming hours. Eliza leaned closer and spoke firmly, telling the patriarch that she did not seek vengeance, only acknowledgement, and that offering the truth willingly could become his final act of redemption instead of allowing the world to define him solely by his darkest choices. The patriarch's eyes softened almost imperceptibly, revealing a brief flicker of the humanity buried beneath decades of hardened pride, and he finally nodded weakly, giving his first and only gesture of consent to release the truth publicly. The room fell into a heavy silence as Eliza stepped back, realizing that she had just witnessed the first fracture in a lifetime of ruthless authority, and the weight of that moment settled over her with both sorrow and profound relief. Margaret placed her arm gently around Eliza's shoulders, guiding her out of the room while the family watched in stunned quiet, understanding that the truth had finally shaken the dynasty at its core, opening the door to a future shaped by honesty rather than fear. The corridor outside the patriarch's room felt strangely lighter as Eliza stepped away, carrying a quiet sense of release that settled over her like a soft blanket after a storm that had raged far longer than she ever realized. Margaret walked beside her with gentle pride, explaining that several family members had already begun discussing ways to repair the damage caused by decades of silence, acknowledging that truth demanded action rather than empty apologies. Samuel joined them near the grand staircase, informing Eliza that the authorities would oversee the transition of estate leadership now that the patriarch had given his final consent, ensuring that no remaining faction could manipulate the narrative again. Eliza looked across the vast foyer, noticing how the once imposing portraits seemed less threatening now, as though the shadows in their painted eyes had softened after witnessing the collapse of the dynasty's long-held deceptions. A few relatives approached her hesitantly, offering quiet words of remorse for past complicity, each admitting they had feared challenging the patriarch even when they sensed something profoundly wrong was being hidden within the estate's walls. She listened with a calm steadiness, assuring them that acknowledgement mattered more than punishment, because healing required courage from everyone touched by the lies that had shaped their shared history. Margaret guided her toward a small sitting room overlooking the winter garden, where the first hints of dawn painted the horizon with muted gold, casting soft reflections across the frost-covered hedges outside. Eliza stood silently before the window, feeling the weight of her journey settle into clarity, as she realized that the truth had not destroyed her, but instead returned the pieces of her life that had been taken before she could form her earliest memories. She thought of her mother's quiet bravery, imagining her running through the dark with a newborn pressed against her chest, determined to protect the fragile future, now standing in this mansion with calm and unbroken strength. Samuel entered the room and placed one final document before her, an official acknowledgement of her lineage crafted by the family's appointed counsel, written with both legal precision and sincere recognition of the harm that had shaped her past. Eliza read the document slowly, letting each word settle in her heart before she signed it with steady hands, symbolizing not only the restoration of her identity but also the choice to step forward without carrying the bitterness of what had been done to her. Margaret embraced her warmly, telling her that redemption rarely arrived through grand gestures, but instead through the quiet courage to face the truth and allow healing to replace fear, even when generations had been shaped by secrecy. As the morning light grew brighter, several family members gathered respectfully near the doorway, acknowledging her not as an intruder but as a rightful branch of the lineage they had once been ordered to deny. Eliza met their eyes with gentle resolve, understanding that forgiveness did not erase the past but allowed the future to unfold without the chains of resentment that had weighed so heavily upon the family for decades. She stepped outside into the crisp morning air, letting the light warm her face as the estate behind her settled into a new era shaped not by power or fear, but by accountability, and the quiet strength of truth finally spoken aloud. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and cold earth, reminding her of the forest where she had first chosen courage over escape, and she realized that every step she had taken since that moment had led her exactly where she needed to be. With the folder secured under her arm and her future no longer hidden in the shadows of a fractured dynasty, Eliza walked down the long stone path, feeling the dawn rise fully behind her as a symbol of the life finally returned to her name.